Think back to 2014. Russia's annexation of Crimea and follow-on operations within the Donbas region kickstarted the Russia-Ukraine war. This conflict raised fundamental questions about Ukraine's continued existence as an integrated state and independence as a nation. These military actions shaped a new and treacherous situation, not only in Ukraine, but also Europe.
Tension rising around the world as Russian President Vladimir Putin casts his shadow across the boundary of Europe and Russia.
We are now deeply concerned by reports of military movements taken by the Russian Federation inside of Ukraine. Any violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity would be deeply destabilizing. The United States will stand with the international community in affirming that there will be costs for any military intervention in Ukraine.
Worldwide condemnation of these actions followed, claiming the Russian aggression against Ukraine threatened the foundations of the international rule-based order. What is alarmingly concerning, though, is throughout this threat, the EU and most of the world were not prepared to respond. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции. Призываю вас немедленно сложить оружие и идти домой.
This operation has already become one of, if not the worst international crisis since the end of the Cold War. Many analysts are worried that a new and terrible stage in the shaping of European borders and populations was emerging. The conclusion of this conflict largely depends on the ability and readiness of the Putin regime to accept the post-Soviet political realities and adjust Russia's own identity to the demand of the post-imperial world. These actions pose a question, and that is, where exactly does Russia begin and end? Who constitutes the Russian people? These two questions have been fiercely debated by Russian thinkers for centuries. The fact of the matter is that the current Russia-Ukraine conflict is only the latest turn of Russian policy, resulting from the belief that Ukraine is an integral part of Russia and has never been truly a separate country. Moreover, the conflict reminds the world that the formation of the modern Russian nation is still far from complete. For many of us today, we face the spectre of not only a new Cold War, but the prospects of a wider general war in Europe erupting if Russia persists with its post-imperial expansion. What complicates things further is the challenge to the international order by the authoritarian regimes such as China. This deeply disturbing picture is made all the worse by Putin's threat of nuclear weapons if its security interests are compromised. Let us be clear, the future is uncertain, and delivery of propaganda dictated by both the East and West further adds to the uncertainty and confusion related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The structure of this video aims to outline the following. Why did Putin decide to attack Ukraine? What is considered decisive terrain for not only Ukraine in the West, but also Russia? And what are the geopolitical implications for the world order? My name is Zero Fox, and in this video we break down the geopolitical implications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Roll the intro. For this question, I believe it is important to understand Vladimir Putin and his decision-making processes. This is no easy task, as what we are essentially trying to do is to analyse what the Putin regime considers a concern to Russian statehood and a national security threat. From what we know about Putin's speeches, he quotes four fundamental strategic priorities in his reasoning. First, there's the humiliation of the collapse of the USSR, and how in his view the US took advantage of a gravely weakened Russia. Second, there's his bitter resentment of what he describes as the expansion of NATO towards Russia. Third, there's Putin's attitude towards Ukraine, and what he claims is the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians as one people. And fourth, there's his aim to reconstruct Russia as a superpower, and to have the West accept Moscow's dominance into its sphere of influence over its former Soviet territories. Let's explore these in detail. The sudden collapse of the former Soviet Union from being a feared nuclear superpower to a second-rate country is unprecedented in world history. Putin described the former Soviet Union as having been robbed and plundered by the West. Former President of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, also accused the US of having a desire to keep Russia half strangled for as long as possible. The transition virtually overnight in 1992 from a centrally planned economy to an extreme form of capitalism resulted in nationwide trauma. In the first 12 months, the former Soviet Union's GDP collapsed by around 40%. People lost their savings and their assured jobs in a country that no longer existed, and there were widespread reports of hunger and even famine. The Soviet Union lost half its population and a quarter of its territory over an incredibly short time, becoming 15 new countries, one of which includes Ukraine. Because of those historical memories, the Russian national perception is the post-Cold War era continues to be one of humiliation and US pride. Russian President Vladimir Putin has described the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 as the demise of the historical Russia, a comment that could fuel speculation about his foreign policy intentions amid the continuation of the Ukraine invasion. Many realists believe that the expansion of NATO is the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. Further, such a decision may be expected to inflame the nationalistic and anti-Western and militaristic tendencies in Russian opinion. They further indicate that the expansion would likely restore the atmosphere of the Cold War and to impel Russian foreign policy in directions decidedly not to our liking. Today, Putin tries to argue that it was NATO that persuaded the former members of the Warsaw Pact into becoming members of NATO. That was arguably not the case, as it was the former members of the Warsaw Pact who were keen to be protected from the resurgent Russian imperialism. Even so, Putin made it clear at the 2007 Munich Security Conference that he viewed NATO expansion as a serious provocation that reduced the level of mutual trust between the East and the West. From Moscow's perspective, NATO has moved 1,800 kilometres closer to Russia's western borders than in the Cold War. If Ukraine becomes a member of NATO, Moscow will be scarcely 400 kilometres from Ukraine's northern border. Putin's aggression against Ukraine, not expansionism, has already driven Finland and Sweden to sign NATO accession protocols, which will expand NATO's border with Russia by over 1,300 kilometres. Of course, it seems absurd that any NATO country would attack a country the size of Russia, but it's a fact that countries with long, permeable borders become endlessly obsessed about their geographical security. We turn now to Putin's attitude towards Ukraine. In 2021, he published a 7,000-word article on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. In it, Putin proclaims that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, share essentially the same historical and spiritual space. It's perhaps worth noting here that Putin has probably now strengthened Ukrainians' nationalism to the point that a forced incorporation of Ukraine into Russia will never happen. Putin has always intended to restore Russia's reputation as a great superpower and end the post-Cold War humiliation. The problem is that by attacking Ukraine and breaking understandings of the sanctity of international borders, Russia's reputation has now been well and truly damaged. By invading Ukraine, many believe Russia was sending a signal to the West, and that the regime had become dismayed that their vital geographical interests were not being addressed. Putin's problem is he now faces a unified NATO and EU. One thing is certain, and that is Russia's relationship with many of the world leaders has become significantly degraded. Due to the invasion, Russia will have to scale back its geographical reach, relying more on key allies such as Belarus, China, Iran, and India. In terms of Russia's place in the world, it will be hard for the Russians, and certainly while Putin's in power, not to be considered essentially a pariah state. Military operations are structured and executed in order to achieve an end state. The end state indicates the desired future conditions as a result of the operation. My analysis is that one of the most vital strategic locations Russia is looking to retain and defend is the port of Sevastopol, located within the Crimean Peninsula. But why is this port so strategically important? Well, operating from Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet provides Russia the ability to project power in and around the Black Sea, while also serving as a potential symbol of Russian power. Sevastopol's warm water port, natural harbour, and extensive infrastructure make it among the best naval bases in the Black Sea. While Russia's current lease of Sevastopol runs through 2042, due to recent events in Russia, many have become increasingly concerned that its future might be compromised. Since the annexation of Crimea in 2014, it is expected that Russia will continue its naval build-up for at least the next 10 to 20 years, placing more modern and advanced ships at the disposal of the Black Sea Fleet commander. These include the new Kilo-class submarines and Admiral Gorshkov-class frigates. The enhanced Black Sea Fleet will also be more capable, providing Russia with a strategic layered defence that only its navy has the ability to provide. Russia's increased presence around the world's oceans will present new challenges for the West and NATO allies, while presenting further opportunity for Russia in pursuit of its protracted interests. An enlarged and more advanced Black Sea fleet has the potential to provoke substantial tension with the United States and NATO, especially in the Mediterranean Sea. So now that we understand the strategic importance of Crimea and seaports, what does this mean for the current Ukraine invasion? And what is potentially the end state? On August the 10th, Zelensky said Russia's war in Ukraine against the whole of free Europe began with and ends with Crimea and its liberation. He further stated that the Black Sea region cannot be safe as long as the Crimea is occupied. This sheds light to the strategic significance of Sevastopol to not only Russia, but Ukraine and the NATO alliance. Based off the aforementioned reasons, I assess that the decisive terrain for the Russia-Ukraine conflict is Crimea. Russia occupies Crimea and a significant swath of southern Ukraine, including the cities of Melitopol and Mariupol, that provides it with a land bridge from its own border to the Crimean Peninsula. This area serves as a vital supply route for Russian military. The fight to retake Crimea could be extremely bloody, in a war that's already led to massive casualties for both sides. Russian-held territory in Ukraine strategically creates a buffer around Crimea. For Russia, retaining this territory is imperative to maintaining the foothold it has within the Black Sea. Crimea is shaping up to be the battlefield that would decide the Russia-Ukraine war. This sets the scene for 2023, which many believe will be the final battlefield of the Ukraine invasion. How the landscapes of war would change is unknown. Liberating Crimea will most likely be achieved by isolating the peninsula via air and land attacks to sever and disrupt Russia's main links to Crimea. These destabilising operations are already underway. On the 8th of October 2022, an attack on the Kerch Strait Bridge was carried out, degrading its use as a logistical route between Russia and Ukraine. This act of sabotage degrades Russia's logistics, forcing resupply to be carried out through the annexed territory to the north and by sea and air, at least until the bridge has been repaired.
Сомнений нет, это теракт, направленный на разрушение критически важной гражданской инфраструктуры Российской Федерации. Авторы, исполнители, заказчики, спецслужбы Украины.
A Ukrainian presidential advisor responded to Putin on Twitter, calling his accusations too cynical. Ukrainian officials welcomed the attack on social media, but didn't claim responsibility.
Once Crimea is isolated, Ukraine would need to employ a wide array of long-range systems against the exposed Russian facilities and groupings in Crimea. With the Crimea cut off from Russia, Ukraine could then soften the military forces, setting conditions for a land assault on military objectives, forcing Russia to withdraw. We live in an era where geopolitics is reasserting its place in the global order. Great power revisionism has now returned, and that two great authoritarian powers, Russia and China, fundamentally challenging the established international order. Russia is currently seeking to carve out a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, whilst China is using coercion in the South and East China Seas in order to assert its rising great power status. Russia and China are both linked together in their rejection of what they see as US hegemony, and in their view, the West has imposed on them the current international order, which must now be rewritten in their favour. Over the past 5 years, the attitudes of both China and Russia towards the West have hardened further, and in their stance against the West, other countries have entered the fold, including Iran, Belarus, and Armenia. The most dangerous scenario for America would be a grand coalition of China and Russia, united not by ideology but by complementary grievances. China and Russia have commonly perceived threats regarding the West and are now sharing an increasingly close strategic relationship. If the China-Russia military partnership continues this upward trend, that will inevitably affect the international security order, challenging the system of US-centered alliances in the Asia-Pacific and Europe. If push comes to shove, Washington will, for the first time, face the threat of a two-front contingency of nuclear war. The central geopolitical challenge for Washington is to detach Russia from China and draw Moscow back into the larger West. But for the foreseeable future, and not least because of its aggression in Ukraine and the resulting actions from the West, there's no prospect of persuading Russia to ditch its relationship with China. The de-escalation of the Ukraine conflict is the most important demand on the world's strategic outlook right now, and due to the condemnation from the West and the brutal sanctions placed on Russia, we're seeing the emergence of a hostile coalition of Russia and China that could eventually seek to challenge America's primacy. Eventually, the Ukraine invasion will end, and that will bring about some geopolitical questions. How would the world deal with Russia as an ongoing future power? No matter the outcome in the Russia-Ukraine war, Russia will continue to exist as a geopolitical entity unless it is totally destroyed by an all-out nuclear war. Kissinger has said, at its end, a place has to be found for Ukraine as well as for Russia. Kissinger further stated that the conflict in Ukraine can permanently restructure the global order, and that Russia could alienate itself completely from Europe seeking a permanent alliance elsewhere. Furthermore, Russia will have to reassess its relationship with Europe at a minimum, as well as its general attitude towards NATO. Where the NATO borders start and end would directly impact Russia's outlook to the West. If NATO boundaries are pushed back, it rewards Russian aggression, and if it is extended further east, it risks shaping the very disgruntled Russia into the very hands of another alliance, one of which may not be favourable to the West. The other associated issue we need to confront is whether Russia is now going to cease to exist as a major power. The worst case scenario for Putin would be for the Russia war in Ukraine to end in a comprehensive military defeat. The consequences of that calamity would be far-reaching, plunging Russia into an identity crisis with unpredictable political consequences. For now, Ukraine is the heart of the matter, because without Ukraine, the dream that Russia can recapture its status as a superpower would be incredibly difficult. That would not only challenge the personal legitimacy of Putin, but also the idea of Russian exceptionalism. Putin and those around him know that in Ukraine they're fighting only for the adjustment of frontiers. They're fighting for their unique world, and it may be psychologically impossible for them to accept defeat. What we are witnessing in Ukraine today may be the prolonged death throes of the Russian Empire, which started 30 years ago with the end of the Soviet Union. But how much weaker and smaller may Russia become? The long-term trend of Russian culture and its economy, especially under sanctions, will further weaken Russia. Moscow's military power and sheer size have led most commentators to describe it as a major power. But in view of the dismal performance of Russia's conventional military power in Ukraine, we must now revisit that judgment. Well, there you have it, folks. I hope you enjoyed the upload. I have a few ideas coming together for my next video, so stay tuned. If you enjoyed the video, perhaps hit that subscribe button. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments section. What are your thoughts on the Ukraine war? During these uncertain times, I hope you keep safe, stay informed. This is Zero Fox, out.